that can play whatever sport, and you're just like blown away, and you're a scout, and you think you found a jewel, right? Well, that's how I felt when I met this man. In the veteran world, there's not many like him that are left. And there weren't many like him to begin with. This is Mr. Roc Smith. He goes by Doc Roc. He taught school for 50 years. He taught for 20 at Oakwood or 30?
21 at Oakwood.
21 at Oakwood. And for 50 years he taught school. Mr. Smith was a Buffalo soldier. And he fought in Italy. And the town that he was in was overrun. And at that particular time, they had been told that Hitler had issued a directive that African American soldiers who were captured would not go to POW camps. They would be executed. So at the time that his town was overrun, there were a lot of his fellow soldiers who ran out into fire because they did not want to be captured and executed, and they committed suicide in that way. But Doc decided he wasn't going to do that. And I'm going to let him tell you that story. But he was eventually captured, and he was one of roughly 200 African Americans that made it out of Hitler's POW camps alive. He's a Purple Heart recipient, and he's got a phone. Purple Heart recipient. His Bronze Star for treating the wounded while under fire and wounded himself. So you're looking at a real American hero.
Okay, let me explain how I got that name Doc Roc. Because when I was 10 years old,
Did we turn it off? Let me turn it off.
Yeah. When I was 10 years old, my official name was Roc. And as you can see, my name is Rothaker, but that gives people a hard way to go to pronounce Rothaker. And so I was officially christened Roc by my father. But 40 years later or so, when I was teaching, I finally got a doctor's degree. And so I told my students, you can call me by my nickname if you put the title in front of it. So I became known as Doc Roc. And it's one word, D-O-C-R-O-C-K, and it is my official nickname that students and everybody calls me by. I was drafted in World War II, and I was in Detroit, Michigan, and I went to Battle Creek, Michigan for my induction and all of that. And at Battle Creek, the fourth day I was there, they picked out 16 of us from Detroit, Chicago, and one or two were from Bay City, Michigan. And they put us on a train, and officially sent us down to South Georgia to a camp where there were 800 and some black soldiers who were trying to learn how to fire anti-aircraft weapons. And so we were assigned as the medics. We got on-the-job training. I remember the first time I had to give this brother in the outer quarter of his hip a needle about so long, almost 3 inches, and just before I went to plunge it in, he tightened his muscles, and I made a scrape across both cheeks. And then I ducked because he swung at me. But we finally learned and became soldiers. And then, much, much later, through many different adventures and so forth, because at that time they said that Afro-Americans were not fit for combat. And so later on, at D-Day, which you have heard about this morning, that I was assigned to a regiment that had been sent to southern Italy to guard air bases and bomb dumps all over southern Italy. And I was a medic, and so I would be assigned with a company that was doing guard duty. So all I had to do every morning was to hold sick call. And if somebody was sick, I had to put a tag on them and send them to the hospital. A weapons carrier or something would come around and make a trip to the hospital every day. I was free the rest of the day. And at one time, I had a vehicle that I could drive, and so I would spend time with my vehicle exploring the middle of Italy, which, you know, Italy is a kind of a narrow peninsula-like, and it has mountains down the center of it. And I had a Dodge weapons carrier and so I would decide to go up on a mountain and visit the people up on top. But I found out that the Dodge would only go uphill about 2 miles. And then on this curvaceous single file road, I had to go backwards down. I would coast because the engine would quit, so I had no engine, but I could coast backwards downhill, and I learned to drive like 40, 50 miles an hour going backwards downhill. Before that, I had some fun driving a Jeep, because the Jeep was a beautiful vehicle, and it still is in my mind. And the medical attachment with this anti-aircraft unit had a doctor who was in charge of the 16 of us who were the medics. And since I knew how to drive, he was issued a brand new Jeep. I think the first time I saw it, it had 10 miles on the odometer. And I was assigned as the driver. And I liked that Jeep. And so the first or second night that we had the Jeep, and I would go to the barracks where us medics were and go to bed as usual. But part of our cadre, a corporal who was supposed to, he had been in the Army much before we had, and so he was supposed to kind of train us and tell us and this and that and the other. So he came and woke me up and said, "Let's go for a ride in the Jeep." And I said, "Amen." And so we got in that Jeep, and we would drive different places. A certain place we could jump off a low cliff and sail through the air 10 feet or more before we landed. And we just did all kinds of things with that Jeep. And this happened 2 or 3 times. And then later on, my lieutenant, who was our doctor, and I was taking him somewhere in the Jeep, and he looked at the official trip ticket, and it said that we had driven 25 miles. He looked at the odometer, and it said 1,500 miles. So he turned the Jeep in and got a weapons carrier, and that's what I drove from then on, but not at night like I used to with the Jeep. Anyway, we were guarding the planes of the 15th Air Force, and when D-Day came in southern France, I was with a group, the medic, and I had done the sick call that morning, and then I was lying down under a tree that was a good shade tree, and I could look up and see the planes of the 15th Air Force from all over southern Italy forming a giant circle. And they kept circling, and more groups came and joined them until I counted over 800 and some planes. And then they all turned and headed towards southern France. That was D-Day. And I was glad to be unfit for combat on that day, because that's the day that over 4,000 troops lost their lives on the beaches. But later on, they decided that we were fit for combat. And so I ended up in a little town called Somacolonia, Italy, as attached to a company that was guarding a small town on top of a hill. Now these towns, the buildings were made of stone. Most of them were 400 and 500 years old. There was only 2 buildings in town that had water in them, but there were town pumps where you could go and get water. But no house had water in it except these 2. And they put me on the front part of the town facing the Germans, and outside the house we were in, it dropped down about 6 or 8 feet, and that was where the ground ended. And from there on, up a slow ascent was a hill, and up on top of that hill was where the Germans were. And it was so hilly that the Germans could not use their cannon to shoot at our town. All they could do was send mortar shells. And there were 60-millimeter mortar shells, which is about this tall, solid cast iron with fins on it and so forth, and a 120-millimeter mortar shell, which is about this tall. It weighs about 60 or 70 pounds of iron and full of gunpowder. And a mortar shell, you have to aim it up, and then it falls on its target. You can't aim it at the target like you can a cannon. And so we would get shelled every now and then, and most of the time they'd hit the side of a building and just knock some of the ivy off. And so we didn't pay a lot of attention to them. To get up to the town, we had to climb a narrow trail, and it was so hilly that they sent our food up to us by mule train. A Jeep could do it in front-wheel drive, but very few other vehicles could get up this hill. And so our food came every day by mule train. They assigned me to be stationed with a machine gun squad that was on the front part of the town facing the Germans, because they said there's likely to be casualties there, and so we need a medic right there. And so since medics were unarmed, then I became the official cook, and we were occupying a house that the people had moved out of. By the way, this town normally had about 250 residents. About 150 were still there in spite of the fact that it was the front line, et cetera. And and what the food was they gave us, they called it 10 in 1. A box about so big had enough food for 10 men for 1 day or 1 man for 10 days. And the people who had been in the house had left their silverware and their plates and everything. So instead of fixing the food and loading it into their mess kits every day, I actually set a table with knife and fork and spoons and plates and everything. And since after we would eat, I would not wash the dishes until it was time to eat again. Because I said, if a shell gets through that window or something and messes up my clean dishes, I'm gonna be mad. And so I would wash the dishes just before each meal. On Christmas Day, 1944, they shelled intermittently through the day. So the mule train could not come up to us until after dark on Christmas Day. So I said, okay, and there was mashed potatoes and gravy and turkey and so forth. So this will be our breakfast tomorrow. And then during the night, the hill leading down from the Germans had trip flares. In other words, a wire about 10 feet long, about so far above the ground, and if you touched the wire, it sent off a flare that would shoot up into the air, then open like a parachute with a bright light under it. And so anybody trying to creep down that hill, they would send off these flares every now and then. So our sergeant called to the artillery and said, put a barrage on that hill. But our general commanding he wanted to save the army some money. So he had rationed our ammunition. So the artillery said, we can't fire anymore until tomorrow morning. And so we saw these flares, and then just about half daybreak, I got up and went to get some water so I could wash the dishes so we could have this turkey, roast turkey and mashed potatoes and all for breakfast. And a shell or two were still flying, like one shell hit the third story of a building and just burst up against it, but a piece fell down at my feet. And I started to pick it up. I said, this will make a nice souvenir. I'm gonna take it home with me. But I didn't get a hold of it because it was red hot. So I couldn't touch it. But I got the bucket of water. I came back and I hung it over the fireplace. And I was standing there in a room that had a window facing the enemy, and we had a wooden shutter over the outside of it, and we had nailed a raincoat across the inside of it. And so I was standing facing that window, and I had my helmet on, and all of a sudden a voice told me, put your aid kits on. Now, I don't know whether it was an angel, the Holy Spirit, or Jesus himself, but I heard those words. So I went to the far wall and bent down to get my aid kits, and then a 120 millimeter mortar shell burst through the window and just plastered me with metal and glass and dust from the shutters and splinters and pieces of rock, because it took a lot of the rocks around the window out and blasted me. and there was one piece about the size of one finger joint that went in my shoulder and traveled about 5 inches and stopped. And I didn't know where it stopped because there was no scar there. There was nothing there. And it took me 10 years before I found out that that piece of metal was in my back. Because the only way it would show up, and this happened 10 years later, I was teaching at Oakwood, and if I would move my shoulder a certain way, then that piece of metal would push a lump up into my back. And my wife saw that lump one day when I was tying my shoe. And 10 years, almost to the day after it went in, I got it taken out. I had to go to Tuskegee Institute to VA hospital, and they took it out. And now that metal is in possession of the World War II Museum in New Orleans. But at the time, I didn't know it was there. But this elbow got all torn up and was bleeding, and so much that I had to put a tourniquet on it to stop it. And I had a hole in my cheek. I could stick my finger in my cheek and touch my teeth. I had a piece of glass right under this eye, and scars and a whole bunch of metal in my hip, just above the hip bone, and just below the hip bone. And so I was really plastered up. And there was a sergeant standing kind of beside the window with me, my sergeant, and his right hand, his little finger was just hanging down by some skin. He had some holes in his chest. He had a few scars and so on his face. On his left leg, he had a 4-inch hole that I put a 4x4 bandage into the hole. And I began to realize, now the guys in the squad call me a saint because I didn't curse and swear like they did. And I thought that I was kind of straight, and really, a whole lot of soldiers think the first time they face firing and all, that you're gonna get hurt, and I'm gonna have to tell your mother about what you did and all, but nothing's gonna happen to me. And then I began to realize that I'm getting ready to die. And my blood was running down both legs, and I started thinking, now I'm about to die, and I'm not ready to die. So I started trying to pray, and something kept telling me, you're too late. You should have done this last week. It's too late. You can't pray. And I had to dress my sergeant's wounds with my left hand and my teeth. There was one other person in the room, but all he got was a scratch in the back of his head. And so I didn't have to touch him. But I kept trying to pray. And finally, something said, your sins are forgiven. Now that came to my mind. I didn't hear any words said like I'd heard said to put your aid kits on. But I accepted that God had accepted my confession and that I had no sin on my heart against heaven. And then I wasn't afraid anymore. I didn't care whether I got shot and died or I lived. It didn't make any difference. But we had heard this, and it was more than a rumor, but we had heard that Hitler had issued the order, kill all black prisoners. And so we knew we were going to die. The Germans would kick the front door of the house and holler something, and they kept passing us, so they had surrounded us for 2 solid days before they started in. And the guy said, the best thing for us to do is to try to fight it out because we're going to die anyway. But a shell had hit the upstairs of our house and put a lot of dust in it. And our guns were jammed with dust and so forth. And so the only thing we would have to fight with were hand grenades, and we had to throw them through a regular doorway. And I said that two of us, our right hands, are useless, and we were both right-handed. I said, throwing hand grenades left-handed through a doorway might kill us as fast as it kills the enemy. So I said, the best way for us to do is to surrender. And they will take us and put us outside that door in the front and shoot us. And it won't hurt near as much as trying to fight it out and getting half wounded with hand grenades and so forth. So they agreed. We knew we were dead, and we knew that we were going to be shot. And so what we were trying to figure out was the way to die without it hurting so much. And that's what we decided. Now, when I faced the enemy, finally, the third day, two German soldiers came in the house, came in the front door. They had to walk down a hallway beside the room we were in to where the doorway of the room was. And they got about halfway down. I hollered, "Kamerad," and they turned and ran. And then they got three more, and they were out in front of the house. And so I finally asked, "Anybody parlo Italiano?" And one said he did. So we talked in Italian. He said, "How many are there?" I said, "There are three." He said, "Come out with your hands up." But by that time, the sergeant's leg had become as stiff as a board. And I said, "One can't walk." He said, "Come out anyway." So we had to drag him between us. And so when they saw him and his leg and all, they said, "Take him back, and then the two of you come out." And so when I came out, I saw these 5 muzzles of the gun pointing right at me, and I knew that in a few seconds or so, I was going to be dead. But I had been talking to Jesus, and Jesus had told me, everything is straight between you and me, and I was not afraid. And I was thinking that once I'm dead, if I'm dead for 10 minutes or 100 years, the time is going to go by just like that, just at the snap. And so I said, I'm about to see Jesus. And I started smiling. And the way I knew I was smiling, because this side of my face was one big scab, and I could feel my jaws on that side trying to smile when this side was smiling. And that's the way I knew I was smiling. And I expected really to see Jesus in the next few seconds. And yet, when I finally got there, and this corporal who could speak Italian told us that he was going to save our lives for us to keep our hands up, and he started telling us to get ready to walk out and so forth. And that's when I was almost disappointed, because I thought, I'm about to see Jesus, and he's not going to shoot me. And so, as I say, I was almost disappointed. Now, I'm looking at the time, and
5 minutes. 5 minutes, yeah, 5 minutes.
pardon?
5 minutes.
Okay. So they took us prisoner, and 2 days later, because the corporal that could speak Italian, later on, he was my guard, and I had to sit beside him in a kind of a town square, and we could talk. And he had been in the Army, he was 22, and he had been in the Army since he was 16. And I'd only been in the Army like 8 or 10 months then. And but we talked a long time, and we both felt that the war was no good and useless, and the things he'd been ordered to do, he wished he hadn't. And so we had a good talk. And then my time is about up, so what happened was that 2 days later, they decided, instead of leaving us there, because there were 41 of us holding the town, they actually ended up capturing in those 2 days 9 more beside me, so there were 10 of us who were prisoners. One escaped with his life because they ran all the civilians out of town, and so he was with an Italian family, and they put a blanket over him, over his head, and almost covered his face, and they moved him out in a wheelchair like he was their grandmother or something. And he's the only one who escaped with his life that didn't get captured. And so I have to stop.
And I hate that because it's an amazing story and the rest of it is amazing. But if you will go on Amazon, there is a book that he wrote that has the whole story in it. It's called No Way Out by Roc Smith. So if you put in Amazon search bar, No Way Out, like $15, go get that book. He gets the proceeds from that book. So it's a fascinating book, so I would encourage you to do that. So, what an American hero.
You can get it from Amazon.
Thank you so much, Doc. Thank you for being here.